October 1942. The sky over Tunisia was the color of gunmetal, that gray, uncertain shade between morning and oblivion. 25,000 feet above the desert, contrails carved white scars across a pale blue void as a formation of B-17 flying fortresses droned eastward, their engines pounding out a rhythm you could feel in your chest more than hear. The bombers looked steady from a distance, their wings level, their course unbroken, but every man inside knew the illusion. The air at that altitude was thin and cruel. Every vibration felt like it could shake the world apart. Behind and below them, a flight of P-38 Lightnings stretched into the haze, twin tails catching the sunlight like spears of silver. The pilots squinted into the glare, scanning the upper reaches of the sky where danger always came from. The sun. The warning hit the radio first, half drowned in static. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high, diving fast." Lieutenant Harry Vaughn looked up, instinct tightening his stomach before his eyes confirmed what his nerves already knew. Dark shapes were dropping out of the sun, sunlight flashing on their wings. Messerschmitts. Dozens of them. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, shoving the throttles forward. The twin Allison V's 1710 engines roared in protest, coughing for breath in the thin air. The Lightning began to climb, but it felt wrong. Heavy, reluctant, as if something invisible were holding it back. "Come on, girl," Vaughn growled through clenched teeth. "Come on." The German fighters were climbing like ghosts set free. They came in elegant arcs, their engines a whispering snarl in the radio static. Vaughn's altimeter crawled. For every 1,000 feet he gained, the 109s climbed too. Within seconds, the geometry of death had already been written. Tracer fire slashed the air. A B-17 exploded into a cloud of fire and aluminum fragments. Vaughn tried to turn, but the controls felt sluggish. The P-38 didn't want to dance. Not up here. "Brake left! Brake left!" his wingman yelled. Vaughn pulled hard. The twin tails groaned under stress. One Messerschmitt streaked past, close enough for Vaughn to see the pilot's white scarf whip in the slipstream. The German pulled vertical again, already climbing away while the Lightning wallowed below, bleeding speed. In seconds, the enemy was above them again, owning the sky. It wasn't a dogfight. It was slaughter disguised as combat. By the time Vaughn limped his aircraft back to base, the North African sun was setting in blood-red streaks. The airstrip at Bone looked like a scar cut into the desert. Rows of tents, a few corrugated hangars, and the smell of oil, sweat, and burned metal. He taxied in, engines sputtering, the propeller arcs wobbling with uneven rhythm. Ground crewmen ran to meet him, ducking under the wings. When he shut down the engines, the silence hit him like a hammer. "Engine lost boost again?" one mechanic asked, wiping his hands on an oily rag. Vaughn climbed out of the cockpit, face streaked with grime and salt. "Above 22,000, she flies like a cow," he snapped. "Throttle lag's killing us." "We're sitting ducks up there." The mechanic nodded, said nothing. He'd heard it all before. Everyone had. The P-38 was supposed to be a miracle of American design. Twin engines, turbo superchargers, range, firepower. On paper, it could outfly anything the Germans had. In practice, something was suffocating it above 20,000 feet. Every squadron in North Africa was complaining about the same thing. Climb rate vanished in thin air. Power bled away like sand through fingers. Pilots were dying trying to babysit engines that refused to breathe. Command knew about it. Engineering depots had issued bulletins promising performance evaluations and minor calibration improvements. But down here, at the edge of the desert where the sun melted metal, those promises felt like fairy tales. That night, in the dim light of a tent filled with the smell of gasoline and cigarettes, the maintenance crew gathered around a wooden crate serving as a table. They drank weak coffee from tin mugs, the air humming with the insects that never slept. Staff Sergeant William Mack McAllister sat at the end of the table, hands black with grease even after washing. He wasn't much for talk. 30 years old, broad-shouldered, face lined before its time. Before the war, he'd fixed tractors in a small Kansas town. The Depression had taught him what no manual ever could: how to make a dying machine live one more day. He listened as the pilots argued. "They say it's the turbochargers," one muttered. "Not enough boost pressure." "Bull," another snapped. "It's the intercoolers. Air's too damn hot going in." "Lockheed says it's all within specs," someone added, the phrase heavy with sarcasm. Mac said nothing. He just stared into his mug, thinking. Later, when the others had gone, he walked out to the flight line. The desert was cold now, the stars sharp as shattered glass. A line of P-38 stood in the moonlight, their wings glittering with frost. He stopped beside one, Vaughn's ship, and ran his hand along the cowling, feeling the metal still warm from the day's flight. He crouched by the intake, flashlight beam cutting across the ductwork. The intercooler vents were half closed, thermostatically controlled, designed to balance air temperature for ideal performance. Ideal, he thought bitterly. For California, not for Africa. He pulled a rag from his pocket and wiped the dust from the actuator linkage. Inside, the thermostatic valve sat like a mechanical priest, quietly deciding how much air the engine was allowed to have. Mac frowned. "Not tonight, you don't," he muttered. He unscrewed the access panel and leaned in, the flashlight wedged under his arm. He'd seen it 100 times before. Ducts, baffles, cables. But now he looked at it like a man reading between the lines. Air too hot. Power loss above 20,000. Thermostat holding the exit doors halfway shut to maintain optimal temperature. Optimal, my ass. The desert heat wasn't letting anything cool. The air that was supposed to chill the intake was nearly as hot as the exhaust. The engines weren't starving for fuel. They were suffocating on overheated air. He stayed out there past midnight, flashlight beam flickering across schematics tacked to a clipboard. Every time the wind shifted, the metal skin of the aircraft creaked like a living thing. Inside the cockpit, gauges still glowed faintly from the last flight. The manifold pressure dial mocked him. He didn't have permission. He didn't have orders. But he had an idea. He imagined those intercooler exit doors, spring-loaded, obedient, cautious, and thought, what if I told you to stop being polite? The next morning, he walked into the maintenance tent before sunrise. The other mechanics were just rolling out of their cots, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Mac didn't bother with greetings. "Get me the schematics for the intercooler actuator," he said. "Why? You planning to rebuild the whole system?" someone joked. Mac didn't answer. He was already halfway out the door, wrench in hand. By noon, the heat had turned the tarmac into a shimmering lake of mirages. Mac stripped off his shirt, sweat streaking through the grease on his arms, and went to work under the Lightning's left engine. He unbolted the thermostatic housing, ignoring the warning stenciled on the side. "Do not adjust." Factory calibrated, factory. The word tasted like arrogance. He traced the cable back to the intercooler exit doors. Those spring-loaded panels on the underside of the nacelle. He found the stop arm, the locking lever. And then, with a screwdriver and a little stubbornness, he jammed them full open. When he stood back, he wiped his face and looked at what he'd done. The aircraft sat quietly, unaware it had just been rewritten. No one noticed. Not yet. That night, he sat outside the tent again, staring at the stars. Somewhere out there, men were dying because their engines couldn't breathe. He thought of Vaughn, of the look in his eyes when he'd stepped off the plane that day. Exhaustion disguised as anger. Tomorrow, he decided, they were going to fly something different. When dawn came, he was waiting on the flight line. Vaughn walked up, yawning, coffee mug in hand. "What's with you, Mac? You look like you've been up all night." "I have," Mac said, handing him a clipboard. "I did some work on your bird." Vaughn frowned. "Maintenance cycle isn't due for another—" "Just fly it," Mac interrupted. "Should I be worried?" Mac smiled faintly. "Depends. You afraid of climbing too fast?" Vaughn laughed, shaking his head. "You're out of your mind, Sergeant." "Maybe," Mac said, "but I'm tired of burying pilots." The engine started at sunrise, coughing once before settling into that deep, even hum that made the desert tremble. Vaughn taxied out, throttles forward, twin tails cutting through the morning light. Mac stood at the edge of the runway, arms crossed, watching the lightning accelerate. At 5,000 feet, it looked normal. At 10, it still climbed steady. At 15, where the engine usually began to struggle, it kept going. The radio cracked with static. Then Vaughn's voice came through, breathless, almost laughing. "Mac, what the hell did you do to her?" Mac said nothing, just listened as the engines faded into the thin air. 20,000 feet. 25, still climbing. He smiled. "Just gave her air," he whispered. The morning over the desert was pale and quiet. That strange stillness before the world remembers it's alive. The P-38. Lightning sat at the end of the strip, its polished skin already reflecting the sun that hadn't yet cleared the dunes. Mechanics stepped back, hands on their hips, the smell of oil thick in the air. The engines began to turn, slow at first, coughing, then roaring into rhythm. Dust swirled around the landing gear as the twin props blurred into transparent discs. Mac watched from 50 yards away, his heart beating faster with every revolution. He didn't pray, not exactly, but something inside him was whispering the way men do when they've done something dangerous and can't take it back. Vaughn rolled forward, tail lifting, the sound deepening into that particular thunder the lightning made when it stopped being a machine and became a force. The takeoff looked normal. The climb didn't. At 1,000 feet, the plane rose sharper than usual, nose pointed higher, prop tips glinting. The desert dropped away faster than it ever had before. At 5,000, Mac shaded his eyes and tracked the silver shape until it was a dot. The sound faded into the wind. Around him, the other mechanics murmured, uncertain. "Boost looks good," the radio operator said from the tent. "Temperature steady. Wait, she's still climbing?" At 10,000 feet, the pilot's voice crackled through static. "Engines are running cold." Cold. The word hit like a slap. These engines never ran cold up here. At 15,000 feet, the climb didn't slow. "Still climbing," Vaughn said, laughing now. "Feels like she wants to go to heaven." At 20,000, where the throttle usually died and the power curve fell flat, the lightning still pulled strong. The radio operator turned to Mac, wide-eyed. "You hearing this?" Mac didn't answer. His mouth was dry. 25,000. Manifold pressures holding. Jesus, Mac, she's still got climb left. 30,000. Holy hell. The voice broke into laughter that sounded like disbelief wrapped in adrenaline. "Mac, she climbs like a homesick angel." The tent erupted. Men who hadn't smiled in weeks started cheering. One of them grabbed Mac by the shoulders. "What the hell did you do?" Mac stared at the sky, the faint contrail curling upward like a white ribbon. "I just let her breathe," he said softly. When the lightning came down 40 minutes later, Vaughn taxied in grinning like a madman. The props wound down to silence. He pulled off his goggles, jumped from the wing, and caught Mac by the arm. She climbed through 28,000 like she had something to prove. Head temps never went red. Boost pressure solid the whole way up. "What did you do to her?" Mac wiped the sweat off his forehead with the back of his hand. "Opened a few doors," he said. Vaughn stared at him, waiting for more. But Mac wasn't the kind of man who bragged. The pilot laughed, shook his head, and shouted to the rest of the crew. "You hear that, boys?" We got ourselves a miracle worker. The others gathered around the aircraft, running hands along the nacelles as if it were alive. They could see the difference. The small changes that didn't look like much, but meant everything. The intercooler doors were fixed wide open, baffles pulled out, the ducting raw and free. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. For the next few days, Mac repeated the modification on another Lightning, then another. Each one came back from test flights with the same report. Stronger climb, lower temps, engines that finally felt awake. By the end of the week, word had spread through the squadron. Pilots were asking for Mac's birds. They scribbled their names on clipboards, trading flights just to get into one of the modified planes. Someone painted a lightning bolt on the cowl and scrawled "White Lightning" beneath it in chalk. Officially, it was all unauthorized. There were rules, manuals, technical orders written by men in offices thousands of miles away. Unofficially, nobody cared. The modifications saved lives. That was enough. Vaughn's flight log showed the proof. Missions that used to end with gasping engines and desperate dives to safety now finished with altitude to spare. The P-38s could finally fight where the bombers flew. The Messerschmitts no longer owned the top of the sky. But with every success came the same quiet fear. Someone from higher up would eventually notice. Field modifications like this had ended careers before. Mac knew it. He'd seen it happen in motor pools back home, someone trying to help, getting buried under paperwork instead. So he kept his mouth shut and kept working. One afternoon, a captain from another unit landed at the strip. He'd heard rumors about a Lightning that could climb like a rocket. He walked straight to Mac's tent. "You the guy?" Mac looked up from a disassembled turbo housing. "Depends what you're asking." "I'm asking how the hell your P-38s are running cooler at 25,000 than ours at 15. Mac wiped his hands on a rag. "Maybe you're babying them too much?" The captain narrowed his eyes. "Don't play coy. My CO wants to know if it's something we can copy." Mac hesitated. He wasn't sure how much to tell. Finally, he said, "Open the doors. All the way. Let the air move." The captain frowned. "You mean the intercooler exits? Those are thermostatically controlled?" "Not anymore," Mac said. "You're insane." "Maybe. But my pilots are still breathing." The captain stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Send me the layout." Quietly within a week, a second squadron was modifying its aircraft, then a third. Mechanics traded notes scribbled on the backs of maintenance forms, diagrams drawn in pencil on mess hall napkins. There was no memo, no official directive, just word of mouth and the shared urgency of men who refused to lose another friend to an engineering oversight. By March 1943, the rumor had reached headquarters in Algiers. A technical officer showed up unannounced, clipboard under his arm, his boots too clean for the desert. He watched the crews working and frowned at what he saw. "You bypassed the thermostatic control?" he asked, voice sharp. "Yes, sir," Mac said without apology. "That's unauthorized." "Yes, sir." "Why?" Mac didn't hesitate. "Because it works." The officer's expression hardened. "Do you have test data?" "I got pilots coming home," Mac said. The officer stared at him, then turned to Vaughn, who had just landed. The pilot still had the grin of a man who'd stared death down and lived. "How's your aircraft performing?" the officer asked. "Better than any Lightning I've ever flown," Vaughn said. "Sir, we're finally climbing with the Jerrys instead of running from them." The officer scribbled something on his pad, then sighed. "All right. Keep it up, but don't talk about this outside the unit." After he left, Vaughn turned to Mac. "You think he'll file a report?" Mac shook his head. "Doesn't matter. They'll hear about it soon enough." They did. By April, maintenance officers from England and Italy were sending radio messages requesting the details of the White Lightning modification. Some called it a miracle. Others called it reckless. Either way, the results spoke louder than protocol. When the first combat report came back confirming kills at 28,000 feet, a place no lightning had ever dominated before, the debate ended. Pilots toasted with tin cups that night. The whiskey burned down their throats, the laughter echoing across the desert. Vaughn raised his cup to Mac. "To the guy who taught the lightning to climb." Mac shook his head. "I didn't teach her anything," he said quietly. "I just stopped telling her what not to do." They drank under a sky full of stars, the engines cooling in the dark, the desert wind whispering through open intercooler doors that no longer waited for permission to breathe. By summer, the modification had spread farther than anyone expected. Engineers at Wright Field were still drafting memos, still planning controlled tests, still waiting for signatures. Out here, the war had already moved on. Every time a P-38 took off now, Mac would stand at the edge of the runway, watching the sun flare on its silver wings as it climbed. Sharp, clean, unstoppable. He'd listen until the sound faded into the thin blue. A reminder that somewhere up there, another pilot was alive because one mechanic had decided that rules didn't matter as much as air. And for the first time in months, the desert didn't feel quite so heavy. By May 1943, the rumor had become a current running through every P-38 unit from Tunisia to Tripoli. It started with a phrase pilots whispered over mess hall coffee: "Homesick Angel." That was how one lieutenant described the climb. From there, it turned into shorthand for the modification itself. No one called it a bypass or a field hack anymore. It was the Homesick Angel fix, and if your squadron didn't have it, you were behind the war. The first official recognition came the way most things did in wartime. Not through an order, but a reprimand. A message arrived from Theater Maintenance Command warning all units against unauthorized alterations to turbo supercharger or intercooler control systems. The paper smelled of ink and headquarters air. It was written by someone who had never knelt in sand hot enough to burn through canvas boots. The memo hit the squadron like a joke. Vaughn pinned it to the wall of the maintenance tent, right beside the roster of pilots who hadn't come back. Beneath it, Max scrawled a single line in pencil: "Tell headquarters to come fly one." Nobody erased it. Still, the attention meant the rumor had reached the top. Somewhere between a pilot's grin and a maintenance log, someone at Wright Field in Ohio had heard about P-38s climbing higher than they were supposed to. In June, an engineering liaison arrived. A major with clean boots, new goggles, and a face that looked allergic to dust. He asked for the mechanic in charge. "That'd be me," Max said, wiping his hands on a rag dark with oil. The major's eyes went to the modified nacelle, to the jammed open exit doors. "Who authorized this?" "Nobody," Max said. "That's why it works." The major sighed, stepped closer, ran his hand over the aluminum skin. "You know what happens if this causes a failure?" Mac nodded. "Same thing that happens if it doesn't, except more of our boys come home." The major didn't answer right away. He just stood there, squinting against the sun. Then he said quietly, "You realize this violates about half the engine manual." Mac's voice stayed calm. "Manuals for peace. This is war." The major left without saying another word. 2 days later, a C-47 landed at the field carrying engineers and recording equipment. They spent 3 days measuring boost pressure, temperature differentials, rate of climb. When they left, they took one of the modified Lightnings with them. For a week, the base felt hollow. Then the reports started coming back through the channels that mattered. Pilot chatter. The test aircraft had reached 30,000 feet with power to spare. Engine temps stayed green. The crew chiefs at Wright Field, usually tight-lipped, started using the phrase field miracle in their notes. By late July, Lockheed engineers had copies of the schematics. In their glass offices in Burbank, they unrolled diagrams traced in pencil on dirty paper. Someone had mailed them from North Africa. No sender, no signature. On the bottom corner, in grease-smudged handwriting, were 4 words: Let the engines breathe. The engineers argued for days. Some called it reckless. Others called it brilliant. One older designer, a veteran of the pre-war days, finally stood up during a meeting and said, "Gentlemen, we're being out-engineered by a sergeant with a wrench. Let's start listening." And they did. Back in North Africa, the war rolled on. The desert wind carried the smell of cordite and burned oil, the language of machines and men too long at war. Pilots flew longer missions now, higher altitudes. The German 109s still came, sleek and vicious, but the fights were different. One morning in August, Vaughn's squadron escorted a formation of B-24s over Sicily. At 27,000 feet, enemy contacts appeared. 6 Messerschmitts, diving out of the sun. Vaughn pushed the throttles forward. The response was instant. The lightning surged upward like it had been waiting for this. His wingman's voice came through the headset, tense but steady. "You with me?" "I'm already there," Vaughn replied. They climbed head-on into the attack, met the Germans in the vertical, and for once the Americans weren't at a disadvantage. The sky became a ballet of white trails and fire bursts. Vaughn got behind one of the 109s, squeezed the trigger, and watched tracers walk across the Germans' fuselage. It disintegrated in a spray of debris. When they returned, their briefing officer listened to the debrief, jaw tightening as he wrote, "That's the 3rd engagement this month above 25,000 with positive results," he said. "You realize this changes doctrine." "Changes everything," Vaughn said. He wasn't exaggerating. Before the modification, P-38s were considered mid-altitude workhorses, reliable but unspectacular. After, they were predators. They started taking missions that had been reserved for Thunderbolts and Mustangs. In the evenings, when the air cooled and the sky turned the color of steel, Mac would sit on an empty crate outside the hangar and watch the horizon. Every takeoff sounded like vindication. Every engine that roared into life reminded him of the first night he'd broken the rules. One of the younger mechanics sat beside him once, nervous, unsure if he should speak. "You ever worry it'll blow up in our faces, Sarge? That they'll come down here and court-martial us all?" Mac smiled without looking away from the runway. "If they come down here, it means they heard about it. And if they heard about it, it means it worked." The kid laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from believing for the first time that maybe you're on the right side of history. By September, the modification had crossed the Mediterranean with the units moving into Italy. P-38s with the homesick Angel Fix were flying out of Foggia, escorting bombers deep into the Balkans. The Luftwaffe started filing reports about improved American twin-engine fighters exhibiting unexpected climb performance. They gave them a nickname: Blitz Teufel, Lightning Devil. One German ace, captured later in the year, told interrogators he'd nearly collided with one over the Adriatic. "We were at 28,000, he said. "He should have stalled, but instead he rose past me like I was standing still." The interrogator noted it in his report and underlined one phrase: uncharacteristic power at altitude. Back in Burbank, Lockheed engineers worked day and night refining what they now called the revised intercooler airflow system. They weren't ashamed to admit where it came from. In internal memos, the source was listed as field-inspired solution, North Africa Theater. By October, the prototype for the new P-38J model rolled out of the test hangar. It had bigger intercooler doors, re-angled ducts, and thermostatic valves tuned for one thing: maximum cooling during combat power. The test pilots at Muroc called it a monster in the climb. In the desert, nobody cared about designations or memos. They just cared that their planes came back. That autumn, the squadron moved to a new airstrip carved out near Benghazi. The nights were colder there, the stars sharper. Vaughn visited the maintenance tent less often now. His bird rarely needed work beyond routine checks. Mac didn't mind. He preferred it that way. Machines were supposed to work so men didn't have to bury their friends. One evening, Vaughn found him tightening a bolt on a nosewheel strut. "You hear the news?" Mac glanced up. "Which news?" "We get about 50 kinds a day." "They're putting your fix in at the factory," Vaughn said. Mac paused, wrench in hand. "You serious?" "Straight from the top. They're calling it an engineering revision." Mac chuckled. "Engineering revision. That's a fancy way of saying we finally listened." Vaughn grinned. "You should be proud." Mac looked out at the sunset bleeding across the sand. "Pride's for peacetime, Lieutenant. I'll settle for pilots making it home." They stood there in silence a moment, the desert wind slipping through the open hangar doors. In the distance, another Lightning started its engines. The twin hum rose like a prayer. Before Vaughn left, he said quietly, "You know they'll never put your name on it." Mac tightened the wrench one last turn and nodded. "Good." Maybe that's why it worked that night. Letters left the base on a supply convoy heading west. Some were official reports. Some were scribbled notes home. One, written on a torn piece of maintenance log, had no address. It simply said, "The desert taught us to listen to the engines. They'll tell you what they need if you stop pretending you already know." It was folded, tucked into a flight manual, and forgotten. The kind of note history only finds when it's ready. Winter 1943, California. The air in Burbank smelled like aluminum dust and burnt coffee. Inside Lockheed's Plant B9, a dozen engineers stood around a stripped-down P-38 nacelle mounted on scaffolding. They weren't talking much. The sound of tools and the faint whine of a test fan filled the hangar. On a workbench nearby lay the part that had started it all. A thermostatic valve, scorched, jammed open, tagged from North Africa Theater, Unit Unknown. Someone had mailed it wrapped in oilcloth with a note that read simply, "Don't let the engineers close it again." They didn't. The new configuration went through 3 design iterations in as many weeks. The intercooler doors were enlarged, the ducts re-angled, and the valve's calibration raised so it wouldn't close until temperatures hit extremes no combat engine ever would. Test flights at Muroc confirmed what everyone already knew. The field mechanics had been right. The Lightning climbed faster, ran cooler, and finally felt like the machine Lockheed had promised the Air Corps 2 years earlier. At the next production meeting, Chief Engineer Hall Hibbard signed off on the changes. He looked at Kelly Johnson and said, "Sometimes it takes a mechanic to remind us what the manuals forget." Kelly smiled faintly. "Sometimes it takes war," he said. The revised P-38J began rolling off the line in August 1943. It looked the same, but pilots could feel the difference the moment they pushed the throttles forward. The climb was sharper, the power curve steadier. By autumn, deliveries reached England. The 8th Air Force received its first batch at a windswept field in Suffolk, and the crews that had been skeptical of twin-engine fighters took one look at the climb rate and changed their minds. Meanwhile, half a world away, Mac was still in the desert. The squadron had moved north into Italy now, operating from a muddy strip carved between vineyards. The war had changed. The Luftwaffe was on the defensive, but the fighting was still brutal. For every enemy plane that fell, 2 more rose somewhere else. Vaughn flew almost daily now. The missions were longer, the formations bigger. When he came back, he'd find Mac sitting on an overturned drum, smoking the same brandless cigarettes that came in army rations. The 2 men didn't talk much anymore. They didn't have to. A look, a nod. That was enough. One cold evening in November, Vaughn handed Mac a folded clipping torn from Stars and Stripes. The headline read, "New Lightning Model Solves High-Altitude Issues." The article credited Lockheed engineers with significant improvements to cooling efficiency, citing field experience as the inspiration. There were no names. Mac read it, folded it back, and slipped it into his pocket. "Figures," he said. Vaughn hesitated. You should get credit. Mac shook his head. Credit doesn't fly. Air does. That winter, their squadron got the new P-38J. When the first one taxied up the strip, Mac climbed the ladder and ran his hand along the cowling like he was greeting an old friend in a new coat. The intercooler doors gleamed wider than before. The valve housing was gone. The ducts had been simplified. Everything he'd done with a wrench in the sand had been rebuilt in aluminum and precision. He looked at the maintenance tag on the side. It read, Model P-38J, Revised Air Induction Assembly, effective August 1943. No mention of North Africa. No mention of the sergeant who'd started it. But when Vaughn took that lightning up, the sound told the truth. The engine sang clean and strong. The plane didn't just climb, it soared. When he landed, he walked straight to Mac and dropped his helmet on the table. You hear that? Mac smiled. Music. The next months blurred. Sicily fell, then Italy. Missions stretched deeper into Europe. P-38s were escorting bombers over the Alps now, 30,000 feet and climbing. German fighters still came, but the balance had shifted. The Lightning could finally meet them on equal terms. Reports from across the theater told the same story. Loss rates dropping. Pilots surviving encounters that used to be suicide. At night, in the barracks, you could hear the difference in the way men spoke. Less fatalism, more quiet certainty. They'd stopped fearing the high sky. They owned it now. By spring 1944, the modification that had begun in a dusty tent had reached the factory floor. It spread from Lockheed to every depot, every maintenance manual, every aircraft leaving America. Even the P-47 and P-51 engineering teams borrowed parts of the principle. Bigger ducts, less restriction, more air. A whole generation of fighters learned to breathe because one mechanic stopped obeying thermostats. When Mac finally rotated home that summer, the war was still raging, but the tide was turning. The ship that carried him back to New York was loaded with engines and airframes bound for Europe. He watched the crates being lifted onto the deck cranes. Allison V 1710S, intercooler assembly, revised. The markings were familiar. In the harbor mist, the Statue of Liberty looked smaller than he'd imagined. America had changed while he'd been gone. Factories running day and night, women on assembly lines, kids collecting scrap metal. He saw it everywhere, the same spirit that had driven him to open a valve because someone told him not to. He never talked about what he'd done. Back home, he fixed cars again, worked in a garage where the smell of oil felt almost comforting. Sometimes young mechanics would ask him about the war, about what it was like. He'd shrug and say, loud, hot, real. But once in a while, when a stubborn carburetor refused to tune or an engine ran rough, he'd tell them quietly, listen to it. It'll tell you what it needs if you stop pretending you already know. He didn't know that at the same time, thousands of miles away, engineers were building the next generation of fighters. Jets that owed part of their cooling systems to a forgotten fix made in the sand. He didn't know that his nameless contribution had found its way into technical manuals under the line. Revised per field data. In 1945, when the war ended, Vaughn wrote him one last letter. It came in a plain envelope with no return address except somewhere in Germany. Mac, you probably heard. The war's over. We made it. I'm sitting on a captured airfield looking at a row of Messerschmitts. Funny thing is, I don't feel like celebrating. Maybe that comes later. You once told me you didn't care about credit, just air. Well, we got both. You gave us back the sky. I figure that's enough for any man. Von Mack never showed the letter to anyone. He folded it once, tucked it into his toolbox under a set of wrenches, and left it there for the rest of his life. Years later, long after he was gone, a young historian found that letter while cataloging veteran estates. He traced the story back: the field mod in North Africa, the P-38J revision, the memos from Lockheed's archives. When he published his paper, he ended it with a single line. History remembers the designers, but war is won by the men who refuse to let their engines die quietly. The story of the homesick angel faded into the folds of time, like so many miracles born in necessity. But its echo lived on, in every mechanic who learned to trust instinct over instruction, in every pilot who climbed higher than the engineers said was possible, and in every piece of machinery that was made stronger by someone who didn't wait for permission to fix it. The war had made thousands of heroes whose names would never be carved into stone. But in the hum of an engine running just right, in the clean pull of power at altitude, in the whisper of air through open ducts, there was a kind of immortality no metal could match. And somewhere, in the quiet between propeller beats, you could still hear it. The sound of a lightning climbing toward the sun, homesick for the sky it was finally free to own.